And then I'm going to pass it over to our host tonight, Eric Nelson.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Thoughtful Thursdays. Some of you are old timers, some of you are newcomers. So for all the newcomers, I hope you enjoy this and come back again. We're very happy that you've joined us for tonight's program, and just a little bit about UUCC, our community. UUCC of Southwest Michigan in South Portage is an inclusive, compassionate community working towards personal and social transformation, healing, and justice. We provide inspiring programs like this one tonight as part of that work, because we can do more together than we can do alone. And it's only through your generosity that we can continue and amplify these programs and the work we do. Every little bit helps. You can make a recurring donation or a one-time gift. Help us continue to lend our voice of love and justice to this world. And if you would like to make a donation, there'll be a time now. It will be in the chat, or it's on the screen. And you can also use that link anytime that you'd like to make a donation. We appreciate that. So just to begin, introducing Mary Beth. We're so happy you can be here and agreed to come. I guess I will say a little bit of the front end story. There's someone on your screen with the name of Corky there, and her last name is the same as Mary Beth. I think they're related, mom and daughter. Corky Thomas is someone I've known for several years through my weekly meditation group that gathers at Friendship Village. She's been a great teacher, and we actually had a great practice today out at Friendship Village. We always have lively discussions, so I'm glad that you introduced me to your daughter, Corky, and now Mary Beth can join us tonight and share her wisdom. So I'll say just a little bit about Mary Beth. Mary Beth is a graduate of Kalamazoo College, a longtime resident of Kalamazoo, and after many years working in the information and technology at Bronson Hospital, she retired in 2017 to teach yoga and meditation full-time. She was first introduced to the psychotherapy approach known as internal family systems, which we'll discuss tonight, through a workshop with Tom Holmes, who is a WMU professor and psychotherapist that some of you may know, and that was in 2006. She later studied yoga mindset coaching with Karina Mirsky, and who is also a student of Tom Holmes' work. And this work combines IFS and yoga to create a powerful tool for transformation. She completed her level 1 IFS training with internal family systems in 2023. So we've got her fresh, well, not quite fresh off of training, but all that wisdom is ready to be poured out tonight. And we welcome you and look forward to being touched by your teachings and aspire to integrate what you'll be sharing tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I'm glad to be here. So did you want to start with a question for me?
Sure. So Mary Beth was kind enough to work with me, and mainly with herself, to develop questions. We actually had a nice hour-long conversation in preparation for this talk, and it was very broad and wide-ranging, but really amazing. And these are some of the things that came up. So Mary Beth, as a yoga and meditation teacher, how did you become interested in internal family systems? And what's the connection between yoga and IFS? And maybe before you start that question, could you just give a very brief definition of internal family systems? Because I think sometimes people think it's about families, and it could be, but that family can be a little misleading, and then I'll ask you the question again.
Actually, I'll give you my short answer to that question, and then I'll jump right into what IFS is.
Okay.
Okay.
Sounds
So
good.
my short answer to this question of what's the connection between the two is that they are both spiritual paths aimed at alleviating suffering. And so they actually complement each other really well. And people have some idea about yoga, but perhaps not at all about IFS. So IFS, the initials for internal family systems, it means, let me start with this. So the man who created internal family systems, or who developed it, he was a family therapist. Okay, so he was used to working with families and recognizing that all families operated within a system, that there were people often triangulated. There were people that were opposed to how the problem person was handling their problem. And so he was really very focused on understanding the dynamics within families where problems were occurring. And he recognized that that was a system. And as he was working with people, particularly he was working with young girls who were bulimic, and he was working with their families and trying to find some help for these girls. And what he started realizing, he started hearing, particularly from the girls themselves, that they would say things like, well, you know, there's this part of me that just feels really awful. And I just know that if I just eat and eat and eat and eat all these things, that I know that's going to make me feel better. But then when I do that, there's another part of me that feels awful. And it just says all these horrible things in my head about what I just did and how disgusting I am. And then there's that part of me that feels bad comes back. And that other part that says, eat something, you'll feel better. And so he started hearing them use this language of parts. And he was like, huh, this is interesting. And the more he worked with these girls, the more he heard how the parts responded in very much the same way that families did. And so he said, oh, this is just an internal family of parts, an internal family system, which is how it got its name. And so this was in the late 80s that he was developing this theory. And since then it's been really fleshed out and become what they call evidence-based therapy, which means that insurance will pay for it. But in any case, so what came out of this idea is that it is the nature of the mind to have these different parts. And one of the things that he discovered in working with these parts is that all parts really have a naturally valuable role in the system. There are no bad parts, but there are parts that get traumatized or get wounded and end up having beliefs and behaviors that make them seem like they're not so valuable. So like the parts that were really shaming these bulimic girls after they binged, one would look at that and go, wow, that's not a good part. That's not helping the system. But what he realized is that once he got people to a place where they could talk with the part that was shaming them, they could actually have a dialogue with that part and find out that the part is actually trying to protect the person. The part's actually trying to be helpful, but it learned how to do it in a way that was really ugly and not helpful. And so how does this happen? Mostly through our childhood experiences. It could be something really traumatic, or it could be something that's just hurtful or just confusing. It can be your family values, your religious values, the mores that you grow up with shape how the parts learn to adapt in order to fit in and belong and be accepted. And so they end up with they take a hurtful or confusing situation, and they sometimes draw what we'll call false conclusions about themselves and others and what the world is like. And that leads to behaviors that they adapt in order to fit in and survive. What IFS calls these beliefs as burdens. Okay, so I'll talk about that throughout this presentation, that these good parts are burdened with beliefs to the point where they no longer play their valuable part, and instead they do this maladaptive role that is actually causing trouble in the system. And so as an example, myself, when I was a kid, I was really bullied by my older brother. It didn't matter what I said, what I liked. He was always criticizing me, putting me down, telling me that I was stupid and the things that I liked were stupid. It didn't help that I was also dyslexic. And so in school, I was struggling in school. So that kind of also fed this belief that I was stupid. And you mentioned my mother's on this call, but I did get her permission to say these things about her. So my mother was a reading teacher, and she was always correcting my grammar. But because I already was developing this belief that I was stupid, I was also hearing that I was also stupid because I couldn't get the grammar right. But through all of this, I developed this belief that I was stupid. And the maladaptive behavior that came out of that was I learned to keep my mouth shut. I learned to hide who I was, what I liked, what I thought. There's a saying some of you may be familiar with, that it's better to keep your mouth shut and appear stupid than to open it and remove all doubt. I thought those were words to live by. That seemed like a brilliant philosophy to me. And so, yeah, I became a very shy and withdrawn child. And so what happens is that these beliefs and behaviors follow us into adulthood. And even though we have adult parts that know better, certainly there's a part of me that's like, I graduated from Kalamazoo College, I'm not stupid. But my burdened child part, who has that belief that I'm stupid, is stuck in the past. And there are situations that can trigger it. And that wounded child part comes and kind of like takes over my system. And the term for that in IFS is blending. So I become blended with the identity of this stupid child. And it changes my behavior. It changes the way I interact. So, for example, this opportunity to speak with you tonight was a very frightening idea to this child part of me. And so IFS teaches us how to work with our parts. So, for example, what I did starting a few days ago as this nervous part was starting to come up as I was preparing, I would just notice it. Oh, there's that tightness in my chest. Yeah, there's that fear that I'm going to say something stupid or that I'm going to appear foolish. And I would just sit with it and just hold that part with compassion. And then I would also let that part know that you don't have to be the one that gives the presentation. You actually can go and you can either like stay here and sit in my lap and watch, or you could go play, you could go do something else. So I can give that part understanding and compassion for the fear that it's feeling, but also separate from it so that it doesn't take over and make me freeze up. So like this.
Can I ask you a question? Or do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm just curious, what was the process when you entered IFS? How did you become aware of various parts? That, because I mean, sure, some parts are more submerged than others, or there might be a part that you glimpse and you go, I'm not going there. But how do you create that safe space, to begin to know parts that even battle with each other? But that whole spectrum, because I imagine there's more than two parts to.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. There are parts and parts and parts and parts. So one of the best ways that we can start to notice our parts is usually when we get triggered by something, usually is bringing up a part. So if you have a really strong response to something or something that's a little out of character for you, for example, mentioned that I teach yoga and meditation. I also have a road rage part, which is not really fitting within my peaceful, yoga teacher personality. But so it's things like that you go, oh, that's interesting. I wonder where that came from. But I'll also say that I have a very strong analyzing part, and I spent years analyzing my emotions rather than feeling them. And so my analyzer part loves to come in when I have a strong emotion and go, oh, that's because of this, and this, and, you know, connect all those dots and, oh, look at me, I'm processing and I'm understanding. But all that was doing was keeping me in my head and preventing me from being with the part of me that was hurting or feeling whatever it was feeling, whether it was anger or jealousy or whatever it was feeling. And so my analyzing part was actually protecting me from feeling too deeply into the parts that were hurting. And so a couple of things helped for me. One is I was provided with a list of common parts. And I can actually make that available to people after this meeting, where they can look and see, you know, oh, overachiever part, perfectionist part. Yeah, oh, I've got those personality traits. So personality traits are a place to look for your parts. And then it's really helpful as you get to know your parts to notice when they show up. So like, as I said, my frightened, I'm stupid part gets triggered by public speaking, or meeting new people. You know, sometimes that comes up. Like, so this is one of the other things that our burdened parts can have sometimes subtle influences on our lives, more so than the fear of public speaking, where that was very obvious I was getting triggered. There was about 10 years ago, I started noticing that all of my friends were very outspoken and strong-willed people. I had two friends who didn't know each other come together, and they didn't actually like each other because they were very strong personalities, and they kind of clashed a little bit. And I started reflecting on that, and I realized that as I was growing up, my fear of saying something stupid made me be drawn to people who were very outspoken, because then I knew exactly what they thought and I could go along to get along, and that was a safe place to be. The people that frightened me the most were the quiet people. I had no idea what was okay to talk to them about, what was in, you know, and so that shaped my friends, my friend group, to, you know, for years, the people that I chose to associate with. So parts are very powerful. And it does us a lot of good to start to get to know our parts.
So you mentioned about getting triggered. I would imagine parts work can be quite useful in interpersonal relationships. And I'm curious if you've seen, like you said, it's not just about being in your head, knowing where the reaction is coming from, but feeling that. And in that feeling, I don't know if you want to say about how that changes, or the relationship to your parts, how that maybe is part of a healing process. I'm not certain about that, but I'm just curious about interpersonally and how, when those parts come up, how we work with that to engage in a productive way.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's two things that parts work brings to personal relationships. And one is this ability to learn to speak for your parts instead of from your parts. So one thing that I hadn't gotten into yet is that in addition to all these parts, as Dick Schwartz was working with people and identifying all, you know, helping them identify their parts, if there was enough safety and space for the part, this what he originally thought was another part would show up that was always curious and compassionate and calm and clear. And he'd say, well, what part is that? And the people would reply, well, that's not a part at all. That's who I really am. And so he identified this as self with a capital S. And so when we talk about speaking for your parts, we're talking about speaking from that calm, clear, confident self, and saying, you know, so when you're in a relationship and there's conflict, you can say, well, a part of me is really angry at you for doing XYZ. And another part of me understands why you did it. But this part that is angry, it's really about the fact that you really hurt my feelings, that there's another part of me that got really hurt by what you did. And so when you speak from this clear, compassionate place of self, then the other person doesn't necessarily get defensive. I mean, they may, they may get defensive, but that's where the other thing that IFS brings in, because you know that you have parts that get triggered. If your partner gets triggered by something you say, because you understand the nature of parts, you can recognize that, okay, even though this person is responding the way that they are, it's just a part of them that is feeling that way, and they're speaking from that part, and what they're saying isn't necessarily the whole of how they feel about me or think about me. They're just triggered. So those two things, learning to speak for your parts and recognizing that the person that you're in relationship with has parts as well, and that sometimes they're being triggered and speaking from their parts instead of for them. Does that help?
Yeah. And I'm curious that larger, the self with a capital S, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, because that, to me, that's a huge capacity to have enough self-awareness to see what's arising in the mind and the body without being overwhelmed by it, but also not repressing it or ignoring it. Because sometimes we can get to that, large perspective and, oh, everything's wonderful, nothing bothers me. And then, we're not really being authentic. And so, because that, to me, could be that spiritual dimension. You mentioned that a little bit about the spiritual dimension of both yoga and IFS. So maybe say a little bit about that larger self and how that is cultivated and how that interacts with the parts work.
Okay. Yeah, so as I said, Dick Schwartz kind of started discovering that there's this self within people. And the fascinating thing about it is that Dick Schwartz was an atheist, and he started discovering this, this self, and recognizing that it was something spiritual, that it was beyond our ordinary our parts and our ego, that it was something that was more eternal, something more consistent. And so the way that we talk about it in yoga is this idea of our inner consciousness being part of the greater consciousness, or that my individual spirit is just part of a larger spirit that includes everybody. So that's where self comes from. Self is spirit. Self is the essence within us that is the essence that connects everything. And so, although to this day, Dick Schwartz is still very careful about talking about IFS as a spiritual path, because a part of him is fearful that it will be seen as woo-woo instead of a scientific approach to dealing with problems. And so he agrees that self is a spiritual thing, but he always has that caveat of not wanting it to be just that, I guess. We'll put it that way. But so this there's all sorts of words for self. I mean, inner wisdom, inner light, our ground of being. There's our true self, the nature of an essence of the human being. And it's this beautiful source of inner wisdom that has the ability to hold space for these parts. And so what happens in the therapeutic setting is that the therapist is the one holding space, holding that self-compassion, creating self. How am I trying to say this? The therapist is in self and creating a safe space for the person to explore their parts. And by doing that, they're also helping to draw out the person's own self And so that's what Dick Schwartz was doing with these young girls. He was in self without even realizing that that's what he was doing. He was in self. They felt comfortable and safe enough that they could bring forth their own selves. And so IFS is really about teaching people to use their own self energy to bring love and compassion and healing to their wounded parts. And so the great thing about this is that self has the ability to actually help parts remove or let go of their beliefs that they got when they were younger. And this is a process that they call unburdening. So I said that those beliefs were burdens. And so self has the ability to help parts unburden. And then they naturally transition back to their original purpose of the part. So for example, one of the most beautiful transitions that can happen is with the inner critic. When the inner critic starts to let go of the burdens that it holds, it can actually become the keeper of integrity, because that's really what it was trying to do all along through its criticism, was to try to keep you, to hold you to standards. But it was doing it in a way that was probably the voices of other people that it had heard when it was younger that were criticizing it. So it learned to internalize those criticisms. But what it really wants is for you to be a person of integrity, which is, again, part of what self naturally does, is brings forth that integrity. And so then that what used to be the inner critic, now the keeper of integrity, can be the one to step up and say, hey, you're letting that other part get in the way of your integrity. You need to do something about that. And what ends up happening is that self starts to lead the system rather than the parts leading the system. When we don't know we have parts, it's kind of like whatever part jumps into our brain is the one that's leading at that moment. And so as self starts to develop relationships with the parts, then the parts start to trust self to be the one that says who's required at this moment. Because if you think about it, who you are with your friends and family is probably very different than who you are at work, or at least somewhat different. You're more of a problem solver, perhaps, more direct. You're or who you are with your pet or a small child is very different than who you are when you go see your doctor. You don't go into the doctor and rub him behind his ears and, oh, you're so cute, or whatever you might do to your dog or your cat. And so we have different parts of ourselves, parts that are playful and parts that are serious. And when self can be the one to decide who's most appropriate for the situation, that's when that self-led relationship, or that self-led system, finds more harmony. So that, for example, that's what I was doing before I came here tonight. Was I was sitting with my parts and recognizing the one that was scared and saying, you don't have to give this presentation. Let's let the teacher part give this presentation. That's going to be more appropriate than, you coming forth with your fear. So does that make sense?
Yeah. I wonder if you could give an example of working with a part and the self. I don't know exactly how this works. I'm assuming that the self is doing an interview, or the self is creating a safe space to be with a part and understand it, what its needs are, what it's trying to accomplish. And we'll say it's a part that maybe no longer serves us too well. I don't know. It could be. So what does that dialogue look like in IFS, in engaging parts and coming into a place of understanding and healing?
Okay. Mom, can we use our example with going to see the attorney? Okay. So just last week, I took my mom to see her attorney, and we were going to talk about, specifically about advanced directives and the DNR that she had in place. And I went to pick her up, and it was right after lunch, and I asked her if she'd had time to eat. And she said, well, I'm not anxious at all, but I could feel this tightness and like the food wouldn't go down. And I'm like, there might be a little anxious part in there. But this is one of the beautiful things about my mother, is that she has just this beautiful, optimistic, positive attitude part of her. But it sometimes wants to deny the parts of her that are perhaps angry or anxious. And so this everything's fine part was denying the part that was feeling anxious. And so I was like, oh, so I got curious, which is one of the characteristics of self, and said, so that you feeling this tightness in your chest, what if you just put your hand on your chest and just kind of notice that part? And so she did that, and she's like, okay, yeah, I feel that there's some anxiety there. And so that's the first part of the process, is to focus on the part, and it helps to find it in your body. And so she's like, yeah, I can feel that. And I said, so what is this part afraid is going to happen in this meeting? And she paused and she's like, I'm afraid he's going to ask me questions I don't have answers to. I was like, oh, okay. And now this next part is only because I know my mother so well. But ordinarily I would ask somebody, do you have any memories associated with this feeling? But I knew of her memory of when she was in 5th grade and up at the blackboard trying to solve a long division problem. And the nun is standing there over her, pounding on the blackboard, making her solve this problem. And she just froze and didn't have the answer. And so I said, is that the part that's active right now? Is that part that's afraid because it doesn't know the answer? And she was like, yeah. And I said, can you let that little girl know that she's not the one that has to answer the questions for the attorney? She's just a little 10-year-old. She doesn't know the answers, and that's okay. And so my mom was able to talk to her part and say, look, I'm 83. Sorry, Mom, I didn't mean to reveal your age. I've got this. I know what I want. I know how to answer these questions. You don't have to worry about answering. And then my mom said she could see the little girl smiling, that the little girl felt so relieved that she wasn't the one that had to have the answers. So that's a way that you can bring kind of immediate relief or comfort to a part. Sometimes you're not in a position where you can do that immediately. And so part of the value in creating a relationship with your parts is that they learn to trust you, just like in any relationship. The more interaction you have, they learn to trust you. So if you have parts that get activated and that you're in a situation where you don't have time to talk with your parts, you can, just place a hand where you're feeling the sensations and say, I can't do this right now, but I promise that when we're done with this situation, I will come back and we'll talk about we'll have some dialogue about what happened. And if they know you and trust you enough, they're willing to unblend, to back off a little bit and give you space to handle the situation. But then part of that trust is that you will go back and work with them. That's how you build that trusting relationship. You don't just say, hey, we'll deal with this later, and then blow them off. You have to make sure that you do go back and do that work with them.
If you're anticipating, which is probably not a good thing to do in life, anticipating tragedy in front of you, going into a difficult situation with someone you know well or at work or whatever, is there, and there's some awareness of what parts may get triggered.
Mm-hmm.
Can you have a conversation prior to that engagement, and how might that shift or impact the actual experience?
Right. Well, as I said, that's what I was doing before I came to give this presentation. And it's also what Corky and I were doing before we went to talk to the attorney. And so it just helps those scared parts or hurt parts feel more at ease. and allows you to work from a different place. You have a different part that's more qualified to come in to handle that. But I mentioned that these parts feel burdened by these beliefs. And so there's actually a process called unburdening that, as I said, transforms the part so that they no longer live in that fear. And what that looks like, and I've only been able to do this, and I've only seen this done with somebody holding space for me, or somebody holding space for somebody else. I think the unburdening process is very hard to do for yourself because it really requires to get very deep into what's going on with that part. And so what that unburdening process looks like is, it starts very much the same way. But if you think about any time that you've been upset by something, it's like what you really want is for somebody to listen and for somebody to care. And so oftentimes when we were children and we got hurt or were in some sort of overwhelming situation that was overwhelming our nervous system and we were really upset, we didn't always get that loving, caring attention, because sometimes it was our parent that was angry at us, and the person that's supposed to love and protect us is spanking us, or whatever the case may be, and it's very confusing to the child. And or as I said, my brother bullied me, and so the unburdening process is to go back into that memory and let that part really tell you how awful it was and how scared they were, and to really be in it, because they still live in that time, they still live in that memory, and sort of to really let you know about that so that you can be there for them from a loving and compassionate place, and really let them really get everything out, let them feel their feelings, let them talk about what the experience was like for them, and then ask the part if it's okay if you come into that memory with them and ask them what they need you to do. Do you need me to just hold you and love you and listen to you? Do you need me to stop the bad thing from happening? What is it that you need me to do? Do you need to push away the person that's hurting you? And so what this is, it's like a redo. You get to re-image the memory. And although this may sound kind of woo-woo, there's actually science behind this. There's a phrase that we use that says that neurons that fire together wire together. So right now, what's been happening with that memory is just the memory of how awful it was. But then when you, as a loving participant, come into the memory and make something different happen and offer love and compassion, now both of those neurons are firing. Yes, it was a horrible situation, but now I have this loving, compassionate person with me in this situation. And those two things start to come together. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with a man by the name of James Finley, but he's an author. He's also a therapist. And he was at the monastery with Thomas Merton. Some of you may be familiar with Thomas Merton. But anyway, so James Finley talks about this process, and he says it's a matter of holding the hurting part in love until it dissolves in love, and all that's left is love. And so that's where that transformation happens, and the part is able to actually finally let go of the burden. And we actually, in the process, have them physically let go of it some way. And it was developed this idea that it was best to do that with the elements. And so, do you want to burn this up? Do you want to drown it in water? Do you want to just let it go up in a balloon into the air? What are the other elements? Do you want to bury it in the earth? Some way of taking this memory or this belief and just getting rid of it for good, and then bringing them into the current time with you. so that they don't have to stay stuck in the past in that memory. And so those are the parts and pieces of unburdening. But as I said, it's a really challenging thing to do by yourself, especially if you don't have that strong access to self.
Thank you.
But which is, oh,
Go ahead.
well, I was going to say that's actually where the yoga and meditation comes in. So yoga is not just a form of exercise. Some people do think of yoga as just these physical poses that we do, and it helps relieve some stress and create some strength and flexibility. But yoga is actually what they call an 8-limb path. There's 8 different limbs of this path of yoga, and only one of them has to do with the physical poses, and another one has to do with breath and breath work, but 3 limbs are dedicated to meditation. Okay, and so yoga is a lot more about the poses are all about preparing the mind and body for meditation, so that you can strengthen your connection to yourself, to what we call self energy, as opposed to the parts and the ego and the false self learning to connect more deeply and clearly with self energy. So this is how IFS and yoga fit together, is that IFS has this beautiful methodology for how to use self energy to transform these parts, but it doesn't give you anything about how do I make this connection with self? How do I strengthen this connection with self? And yoga and meditation are all about creating that connection with self, and or ground of being, or however you want to refer to it. So that's how the two complement each other. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with yoga, but there are sacred texts of yoga called the Yoga Sutras, and there's 196 succinct little sayings about yoga. And the first one is, now is the time for yoga. The present moment. The present moment is the time for yoga. Yoga, which means union. So the present moment is the time for union. But the second one says that yoga is the cessation of identifying with the thought patterns of the mind. So yoga is the cessation of blending with your parts and instead being in self. And the sutras go on to say, the third one says, in the state of yoga, in the state of union, the seer abides in its truest self. And so, these two methodologies were really just meant for each other.
Thank you for that. That's a little insight. I remember Patanjali Sutras from way back when.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's a very powerful path and a universal one. You had mentioned a connection to your work, and we have a theme this year at our church around the tree of life. And I wonder if you might, and how that we nurture the roots and the leaves and the fruits and all that, how that interconnects with yoga and IFS for that concept of the tree of life.
Yeah. So this idea of nurturing our roots, part of it is, what are we rooted in? Are we rooted in self, or are we rooted in our parts? Where is our strongest draw? And as we've already talked about, IFS starts to help you identify, create some distance and identify those parts so that you can start to have that cessation of identifying with those parts and growing stronger roots with the self. I don't know if any of you are meditators, but that is, what we're learning to do in meditation, right? Is to be more of an observer of our parts or our thoughts rather than to be identified with them. And identifying with this idea of identity, I think, is a really key concept as well, because our origin story shapes who we believe we are. And so if I believe that I have and am this true self, this essence that is one with everything, then I approach the world, I approach myself, my parts, and other people in a very different way than if my identity is stuck in my parts, stuck in what I do for a living, or what part of the world I live in, my political party. There's all sorts of ways that we could identify that that really change how we view and see the world. So this idea of our roots, what are we rooted in, and this connection to a source that is not a constantly changing reality is really key, I think, to this. Recognizing self or grounded being as our source of identity, and witnessing ourselves in the world from a place of love and compassion.
Great. This is my final very short question, and then we'll open it up. I just wonder if you've named some of the qualities of this self with a capital S. If you could just share a few of those. You've said it throughout your talk, but when we're resting in that self and operating out of that awareness and perspective, how does it show up in our?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. And Dick Schwartz identified 8 words that describe self, and they all begin with C. And so it's curiosity, compassion, courage, confidence, clarity, calmness, creativity, and connectedness. So that connection to all, that union that is yoga. And before we open it up to questions, I did want to have one shout out to, I wanted to say that I'm not the person that came up with this connection. You mentioned in my bio, Karina Mirsky. So she was my yoga teacher trainer years ago when I was studying yoga, when I first started studying yoga. And when she was at Western, she was getting her master's degree at Western in East-West psychology. And she wrote her master's thesis on this connection between IFS and yoga, because she was studying under Tom Holmes, who was at the time the chair of the holistic health program. And Tom Holmes had worked with Dick Schwartz in the late 80s as he was developing this idea. And Tom went on to write a book called Parts Work. It's an illustrated guide to your inner life. It's a great place to start with IFS because I think the illustrations really help get this sense of the parts and how they show up. And so I highly recommend that book. But then in 2018, Karina created what she called yoga mindset coaching. And because yogis have this access to self, she could see that yogis would be uniquely qualified to work with people and hold that self space for them to let them work with their parts. And so she came up with this idea that yoga teachers could work one-on-one with clients and help them not only identify their parts, but also to give them both body movements and breath movements to help move, because the parts hold all this energy. Okay, so parts live in our bodies. We call this, we have our issues in our tissues. You know, we hold on to these issues in our body. And so learning to move and release that is a big part of helping parts let go of their burdens. So yoga is really big on this mind-body connection. And so recognizing that what's happening in your mind is also happening in your body, because you can't suppress an emotion without tightening a part of your body. When I first heard that, I was like, is that true? But the more I thought about it, it's like, yeah. So when I'm getting teary-eyed and I don't want to cry, I start doing this blinky thing with my eyes, and I think most people do. So you're like trying to stop that. Or when I'm angry and I'm trying not to say it, I grip my teeth and I get all tight in my neck. When I'm hurting, I collapse. Or my favorite example is to talk about when somebody, I mean, those are like just those are things that we're trying to suppress. Sometimes we try to suppress joy because we're in a place where it's not appropriate for us to laugh. But if you think about it, the body automatically responds to how you're feeling. So if you're at a football game or some other sport that you're really into and your team scores, everybody goes, yay! And if something bad happens, it's like, but the body automatically does that. Nobody taught us, this is what you do when something good happens. This is what you do when something bad happens. The body just knows how to respond. But oftentimes we're in places where it's not appropriate to respond. For example, if anybody plays poker, when you get a really good hand, you don't want it to show on your face that you have a really good hand. So you try to suppress that. So there's a lot that sending kids to school is a great example of how we repress the desire to move and the desire to talk, right? And we train kids from very little all the way through college, sit still, be quiet. And so there's all this tightening that has to happen to keep all of that in. And so this is where that yoga coming in and moving and stretching and releasing what's being held really makes a big difference. So that's why the two fit so beautifully together.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I take it you do this, you do one-on-one yoga and IFS with people, or?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
I've been doing that for a couple of years. And yeah, it's a beautiful practice to watch. I am always in such awe of people allowing me to be their guide in this journey. And it's a really beautiful thing to watch unfold as people get in touch with their parts and start to unburden their parts. It's really, it's beautiful.
Well, you mentioned sharing some materials with the group. We'd love those materials. And if you can have contact information, people want to get a hold of you and
absolutely.
That'd be great. So we're going to open it up now. And are there questions from the group? You can put it either in the chat or you can there's that little emoji thing down there, reactions. You can put your hand up or just raise your hand, however you want to do it. Which part of you is saying, I'm too nervous to ask a question?
Exactly.
Which part of me is so excited, but I don't know how to verbalize it? I don't know what your part is saying. Well, then I'll ask Mary Beth, was there anything else? I think there was a question early on. You were saying, how did you come? Well, you kind of described that. It was your early training.
Yeah. There's actually an unblending exercise I wanted to do with the group, where so just kind of an example of how you can learn to step back from strong emotions. So the first thing I want everybody to do is kind of sit with their feet on the floor and get nice and tall through their spine, and maybe rest your hands in your lap. And just start to settle in. And feel your feet on the ground. And feel your seat resting in the seat of the chair or the couch that you're sitting on. And feeling your back against the back of the couch or chair supporting you. And just start to notice your breath. And allow your belly to soften a little bit. And the breath to become relaxed and effortless. And just notice how you feel in your body. Perhaps there's an openness. And then I want you to bring to mind a situation from the past week or two where you encountered a strong emotion, where a part of you got triggered. And identify what the emotion was that you felt, whether it was anger or frustration, jealousy, fear. Just put a word on that emotion. And then I want you to start repeating to yourself, I am whatever that emotion was. I am angry. I am frustrated. Just repeat that to yourself and really feel into that emotion, that situation, how it made you feel, and just be with that I am statement. And then start to notice where you feel it in your body and how it feels. Is it tight? Is it heavy? Is it hot? Just notice what it feels like and how intense it is. And then let go of that I am thought and come back to your breath and your soft belly. And let the breath feel relaxed and effortless again. And then returning to that emotion, I want you to start thinking, I'm feeling angry, or I'm feeling frustrated. Whatever that feeling was, now it's I'm feeling. And just continue to repeat that in your mind. And start to notice how that feels in your body. And then go ahead and let go of the I'm feeling thought. Take a couple of deep breaths. Let go of that. And then start to think that part of me is feeling angry, frustrated, whatever it is. A part of me is feeling. Notice how that feels in your body. And take a couple of more deep breaths, letting go of that. And then just one last time, we're going to go with, I'm aware that a part of me is feeling angry, frustrated, fearful. Notice how that feels in your body. And when you feel ready, you can open your eyes. And I'll just mention that this is an exercise from a man by the name of Lot Kelly. Some of you may be familiar with his work. But so anybody want to share what they experienced in going through those steps of backing away from identifying with the emotion?
It made a lot of what you were talking about much more clear to me. That part of me is angry. That's not all of me. That's when it sort of clicked with me, and then that awareness. That was very cool.
Awesome. Awesome. Anyone else?
It gave me a sense of freedom. It freed me up when I could look at the emotion and try to understand it instead of still carrying the thought of the anger or frustration.
I I I can see the discrete steps of unblending as you go along. You're kind of putting in a little bit more space.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, it just helped me realize that I'm neither my thoughts nor am I my emotions,
Mhm.
and to put that little space between self and whatever else is going on.
Yeah.
Right, I think that that's part of what I was trying to say too, that freedom, it was the space. It gave me space.
Yeah.
That was helpful.
Did anybody notice how it felt in their body, and did the feeling in the body change as you got more and more space?
Yeah, definitely. I was most contracted at the thought level, and there was relaxation at the feeling level. There was just the capacity to open and not identify as deeply
Mhm.
at the thought level. I think when it was a thought, it was regenerating itself one after the other, and the feeling state created that space for it to just rest and be.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is again this place when we're then aware of this part, and there's this openness and space is where you can be with the part in a loving way instead of being in another part that's frustrated with that part. So for example, my road rage part, when it comes up, there's a part of me that doesn't like my road rage part. And so those two can like butt heads. I just want you to go. One of the things I was actually saying in that exercise was, okay, let go of that. But it's hard to let go of a strong emotion. But when you can hold it in compassion, so rather than thinking about letting go of it, think about having compassion for it, and it goes on its own. So it's not, how do I let go of this because a part of me wants this to go away, but how can I hold it in compassion from self and give it space and time to go on its own? So one of the key parts in working with your parts is to ask yourself, how do I feel towards this part? Because that's going to let you know, am I in self or am I in another part? And those 8 C words, am I curious about this part? Am I compassionate for this part? That can tell you, am I in self or am I in another part? For example, as I said at the beginning, I had an analyzer part that would come in and think about my parts or think about my feelings rather than allowing my parts to feel them. And this can be very subtle. Even as I learned about IFS and I was doing this work, my thinking part or analyzing part would still jump in while I was trying to work with my parts. It wanted to do the work instead of letting self do it. And the only way I became aware of it was that my analyzer wasn't curious. My analyzer wanted to explain what was going on with that part. And I'm like, oh, this isn't self. This is my analyzer. And so I had to ask my analyzer to step back and really allow self to be the one to be with that part.
Could you repeat those 8 C's again?
Yeah, I can send those along with the information that I send too. So it's curious, compassionate, courageous, and confident, calm, clear, and creative. Which I don't know about you, but that's how I want to be in the world.
Well, thanks again, Mary Beth. Any final questions? Comments?
I'll share one more thing.
Okay.
So I am giving a retreat at Gilcrest September 22nd, 23rd, and 24th, where our theme is how does IFS and yoga come together to help us work with our light and our darkness. So it's called The Light Within. It's a yoga and meditation retreat. You don't need to have experience in either. And we're going to explore how those two fit together and how they help us to explore those two parts of ourselves.
Be sure to share that with the other things that you
Okay.
send.
I'm going to write a list.
I'll make sure that it gets shared with the wider community. Thank you.
Okay.
And is that a purely residential retreat? I mean, do you have to stay there, or because it's half an hour from Kalamazoo down to
people can commute if they want to. I think there's a tentative schedule on my website, so I'll send my website along as well. But yeah, people are welcome to commute to it if they want to.
And if you haven't been to Gilchrist, it's a beautiful 65 acres, rolling hills, a big labyrinth you can walk, and
Gilchrist,
beautiful space.
not Gil.
Yeah. No, it's Gilchrist.
Oh, it is? See, I just still don't get these letters right. G.
All right.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
Well, this is a beginning of a journey for some of us, and Mary Beth will be providing more information if you want to go further. And we'll continue with these conversations over the coming months. And I think we're going to close with a slide, and I'll say a few words to close out our evening. We thank you for all of you for coming tonight, and Mary Beth, especially for your insights. And it's our commitment to continue to bring thoughtful, social, spiritual, engaging programs to you and to our community. To do that, we need your support. Again, every little bit helps to continue this work to leave the world a better place than we found it. And thanks for coming. And there's a link there in the chat and also on our website for giving. And just to let you know, in the coming months, well, not the coming months, in the coming week, I will be offering a 6-session self-compassion course that has some of the themes that Mary Beth has spoken to, as well as others. It will have mindfulness and compassion practice, a lot of making friends with ourselves, working with the inner critic, and understanding how to heal that and relate to that inner critic. So there'll be a session every other week, or 6 sessions, so it'll last 3 months, September through November. And that's free. You can go to our website. There at the very bottom of that page, you'll see uucommunitychurch.org. You can go to that website, and there'll be a little slider at the top of that website, and you'll see one of those slides is me, Eric, for my self-compassion workshop, and you can click on that and register, just like you did for this class. And another exciting program that will be coming up, Thoughtful Thursdays in October, a dear friend of mine, Buddhist teacher, he was someone I met when I was at the Fetzer Institute, and he teaches at Spirit Rock in California, Donald Rothberg. He's a great scholar and an incredible Buddhist practitioner. He does, I think, at least about 2 months of solitary practice a year. He does retreats all around the country, has done a lot with spirituality, engaged spirituality and through a Buddhist lens, but he'll be talking also about a wide range of topics at that Thoughtful Thursday, how we deal with impermanence, death and dying, a whole range of issues. You can see that described on our website as well. So a couple exciting programs, I hope, coming up. And I don't know, and visit our website, because we have an interesting speaker October 1st as well. So we have some really cool people coming in, a person from Edinburgh, and we'll be speaking on Jesus and through the Aramaic language lens, and shedding light on teachings that many of us have never encountered, because we've read the Greek versions of Christianity and not the original Aramaic, so he should be quite exciting.
That's Dr. Neil Douglas Klotz, and that's
Yes.
October 1st at 10 a.m. at UCC. You can watch it on Facebook or via Zoom.
Yeah. So thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.